Hi, Dave. Good morning and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Damien. Thanks for having me, man. Good to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see you. So, we're going to be diving into a recent publication that you guys published in Biological Invasions related to forest pests and the global wood packaging supply chain, which is a really cool topic to talk about. But before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit about you. You're assistant professor at Clemson for a few years now. So, tell us a little bit about yourself and, what the focus of your lab is.
Sure, yeah. I've been at Clemson since the middle of 2018, so I'm coming up on that fateful time in any young professor's life when they go for tenure. So we're putting the packet in for that this cycle. But the focus of all my work is very broad: forest health and invasive species. So that basically means at Clemson, anytime a tree gets sick in any way, shape, or form, that call comes to me. It could be out in the middle of the woods in a natural area. It could be in a plantation. It could be someone's tree in their yard. I'm kind of the tree guy, is how it's worked out. So we do deal with all the insects, all the pathogens. I also deal with a lot of weed management, invasive weed management, and this is typically in your natural areas. The kogan grass and kudzu and invasive trees. So it's a really, really broad type of thing. Our lab has a lot of stuff going on. We've got people working on everything from chemical control of miscanthus, which is a fairly aggressive grass. We work a lot with Asian longhorn beetle and invasive wood-boring beetle. We do a lot with calorie pear, which is sort of your feral Bradford pear. Everything from management to ecology of that. So it's a pretty wide-ranging thing, it's got pros and cons, as you might guess. There's always something different to do, but also you're kind of all over the place all the time. But
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
kind of how it works out. Yeah.
So you mentioned that one of the focus of your lab is basically invasive species. So just to have that, clarify that, what are invasive species and how they actually move around from place to place, right? We hear a lot about the impacts, the ecological, the economic impacts of invasive species, but sometimes the reason or the causes of why these things move around is not really explained.
Yeah, so good question. So let's start with native species. So native species is anything that is from here. And so I know here is a nebulous term, but I tend to think of things like this on the continental scale. So if something is originally evolved in North America, it is native to North America, it is a native species. I know people a lot of times look at native, non-native at a country level, but I think there's a little disingenuity about that, because if you've got something that lives in, let's say, southern Texas and it just happens to float across the river into Mexico, is it really an invasive species or is it just moving? Right? I think there's some and this is like you have discussions all over. But anyway, so native species is from here, right, from this continent. Non-native species are anything that are not from that continent. So anything that maybe originated in Europe or Asia or Africa. If it gets here, it's a non-native species. And then invasive species are a little sliver of all the non-native species. I think a lot of people out there maybe have the thought that all invasive species are all the non-native species, and that's not true at all. There's so many non-native species in different continents. You only hear about a sliver of them because they're the worst of the worst, and that's the invasive species. So invasive species have just a few main characteristics. They are not from the country in which they are currently causing problems. They cause problems, whether those are economic problems, environmental problems, human health problems. They cause problems in their new area, and then they have self-sustaining populations. So they're there over years. It's one thing if an example is, let's say, an Asian giant hornet blows into a new area and stings somebody and causes some damage, right? If that hornet never develops a population, it is not an invasive species. It's just something that got in there. We call it an incident. It probably died after it stung someone, and then party's over. But once things like that get somewhere new and start having reproducing populations year after year, then the damage starts happening. Those are the invasive species. Those are the ones that a lot of us spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to manage and how to deal with.
Yeah, so you're mentioning that these things are, of course, non-native from the continent. So how do things move around? because back in the day, 100 to 100 years ago, most of these introductions were basically plant material, right? Or, trunks of trees that were cut and moved to new regions and stuff. But now it's kind of like different. What is different now?
The difference is people, and we do most of this stuff, quite honestly. Um, there are some cases where natural events will move things around. And I'm thinking about some of the hurricanes and typhoons can blow things miles, whether it's on a piece of a substrate of some sort, or a great example is coconut will start on one island and float all the way over to another island and start a tree. That's kind of natural movement, but by and large, the invasive stuff we get is because of humans moving stuff. Um, if you look at the labels of most of what we have in this country, especially in the U.S. is particularly bad. We import so much stuff from all over the place. We're not the only country, of course, but we import a lot of stuff. And it gets shipped over. It gets shipped over in live plants. When people want that European whatever flower in their yard, there can be pests on that. It gets shipped over in just commodities, grain, fruits, vegetables, that type of thing. And then, of course, solid wood packing material. Basically all the stuff that holds all the stuff is a perfect environment for a lot of wood boring pests. And it's something I think that a lot of people don't think about, but if you think about things like pallets, those great big spools that you'll sometimes see that have those huge cables wrapped on them, any big chunk of wood can hold an insect inside there long enough for it to cross the ocean, and it happens quite a bit.
Yeah, so just to clarify, when we're talking about wood packaging material, it's not only pallets, right? It's basically every piece of wood. It could be dunnage, it could be anything that is built with this type of wood, and basically inside the containers, right? This is how most of the invasive wood borers that we see today that were introduced, the last couple of decades, are causing like massive impact, right?
Right, and that's a really interesting point. I mean, unless you've actually been to the dock and seen some of those places where they unload all the cargo, most people just think of pallets as kind of all there is. But if you go to a place where you've got, the Port of Savannah, for instance, all those huge implements have big chunks of wood everywhere. When a tractor gets brought over from, wherever it's coming from, there are big, huge blocks of wood that are stabilizing that are making sure it doesn't move. There's big chunks of wood in so many different things. It's such a great packaging material because you can drill it together, you can wedge it in there. Honestly, it's not that heavy in the overall scheme of things. It provides a really good brace. There's lots of wood that's used in lots of ways that most people don't think about. Dunnage, like you mentioned, sometimes that's just pieces of rough cut lumber they've chucked in the bottom of a ship to balance it. And it's not even treated. It's just they cut some trees down, shoved in there. Okay, now the ship balances right, and off it goes. And then a lot of times when some of that stuff, when these wood packaging things come to a new place, right? Let's say when it gets to America from China or what have you, the pallets are going to get moved around with commodity a lot, right? A lot of the smaller bracing pieces are going to get moved. Like when you buy a new refrigerator, there's usually a couple of chunks of wood on the bottom, right? And those are going to go to whoever eventually buys it. But the dunnage will often just gets chucked into a pile on the dock or at the port. And then maybe when someone needs dunnage to go back the other way, they say, oh, here's our dunnage pile. Just throw that in there to balance it, and off it goes. It's kind of the Wild West of wood packaging materials.
Yeah, and it's also on a scale that is massive, right? Because these are not small ports that we're talking about, particularly the ones that are at risk, right?
Yeah, it's really tough to describe unless you've been there, but it's one of those things where the sheer volume of stuff is just, it's almost like how much, when you talk about our national budget, they talk about things in the trillions of dollars. Most of us can't even comprehend what $1 trillion is.
For real.
It's almost like that when you talk about the scale of the wood that gets moved globally every single day. It's unfathomable.
Yeah, so we're moving this massive amount of wood. A lot of that may contain exotic insects. So the big question is kind of like how to reduce the risk for these invasive species. And it turns out we do have guidelines that are used by these countries to develop regulations for phytosanitary trade, right? And those are called ISPM, stands for International Standards for Phytosanitary Measures. So tell us a little bit about that, and there are actually specific guidelines of these for wood packaging material as well. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and without getting too deep in the weeds, because this is where you get a lot of technical jargon, and blah
Yeah.
blah blah. But essentially, there's this global entity called, and I'm going to read it because I never get it, the International Plant Protection Convention. So this is all the countries in the world have basically sent representatives. They come together, and we've tried to make laws and guidelines to help reduce the risk of things going all over the place, right? So they call that the IPPC. The IPPC has made these international standards for phytosanitary measures, ISPMs, and there's all sorts of them out there. There's dozens of these things out there, dealing with everything from how to safely ship fruits and vegetables to how to contain a pest if it's found, to just et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of them out there. And then the one that we are concerned about is, I guess, as forest health folks, we're mostly concerned with stuff coming over in that solid wood packing material. So ours is, not ours, the one we use the most, is ISPM 15, which essentially set up the international standards for treating those wood products to ensure or at least reduce the risk of any type of pest going from point A to point B. And what this means is all of those wood products either need to be chemically treated or heat treated to a level to which it is supposed to kill everything that could survive inside it. That's the Cliff Notes version of ISPM 15. And I mean, trust me, if you've got, if you're having trouble falling asleep at night, you can Google these things and read these ISPM things. They're a very dry read, and I've read a couple of them just because I felt like I had to. But they're tough to get through. It's just a lot of it's very technical stuff. Everything is very jargony, and they have their purpose. But by and large, that's what it means. That everything is supposed to be treated the same way in every port across the world to reduce the risk of stuff moving.
Yeah, because I mean, these ISPMs include things like the barking and the treatment, and also the mark that these pallets have to have in order to have compliance with it. Because these wood packaging materials are being built based on sometimes very low quality trees, the suppressed ones, the ones that are attacked by secondary pests. So that kind of like helps reducing that risk of moving those things around.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, nobody's going to take a great tree that could be made into lumber for a house. They're not going to make that into a pallet. Pallets and all the solid wood packing material is definitely second-rate stuff, which typically means, like you said, there's likely a higher chance that there's a bug in there. Because if there's not, then it's going to be higher grade stuff that's going to go to veneer or lumber, that type of thing. So you're already starting with less than optimal material. I shouldn't say optimal. It's great for pallets. It's just not the best stuff, right? And there's a greater chance that there's
best quality
some
one,
pests.
yeah.
Not the best quality, right? But it's also a huge, it's a huge industry, and there's a lot of people, a lot of landowners that make a lot of money because maybe their land can't support growing those super high quality trees for the other stuff, but you can grow sweet gum and poplar and some of this stuff, and you can send those to the pallet factory, and you can make you can have a sustaining forest going on, making those products. They're, as much kind of, I don't know, as much crap as they get in terms of like people, I think, demonize them a little unfairly that they're the reason that all heck broke loose over here. It's a really important cog in the wheel in terms of forestry products, in terms of international shipping. And I have heard in the past that, well, if we want to stop this problem, we should just use plastic pallets. And I want to go on record, probably yet again, say that is the dumbest idea I have ever heard. Because the thought in general, there's so many things wrong with that. Plastic is, not even counting the issues with putting plastic all over the environment and making it. The sheer idea of how you would replace probably trillions of pallets around the world with new ones, you're looking at decades of work to even conceivably get that done. Someone's going to have to replace them. Someone's going to have to collect the old ones. Just the logistics of this is, to me, it's an absolute non-starter. And I know some folks say, well, that would eliminate any possibility of a forest pest moving. Yeah, it would, but you create way worse problems probably on the back end. So to me, it's almost like we're stuck with wood, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think wood is good for this purpose. It's just that there are things we can do to maybe reduce our risk, and it's all relative risk too at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, these treatments actually work, right? We've been using it in the U.S. at least. I think from 2006 that ISPM 15 was implemented, and a lot of the biggest problems that we have right now were all introduced before that, right? If we talk about emerald ash borer, if we talk about laurel wilt, if we talk about Asian longhorn beetle, all of that kind of like happened previous to that implementation, right? We're still moving things around, but hopefully that kind of like helped to mitigate the impact of that.
And I think that's one of the best things we can say as forest health people is we have not had a significant wood boring pests get in here since ISPM 15 started. They found some stuff, sure, but I mean that's the point. They've got people that are, they've got hordes of people from Customs Border Protection, APHIS that are always doing inspections. They find stuff. We find stuff all the time. The sheer law of volume and numbers suggests that you're going to find stuff here and there, but nothing is established since pre-ISPM 15. So to me, that says I think it's working pretty darn good, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
the stuff we have had recently, like spotted lanternfly, that came over on, I think they thought stone or something, but we haven't had a wood boring thing established since the early 2000s.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that because you guys did an excellent job describing the whole supply chain, right? Like from the trees being harvested to the wood packaging material being created to basically these invasive species or exotic species leaving those containers and getting established, right? So what are some of the critical points? And, we talked about the treatments, but there are others because we have inspections, we have other items in the process that are very important in terms of like mitigate the impact or reduce the risk, right?
Yeah, some of the critical points are, well, obviously one of the big issues, and this is one discussion point that we have a lot, is every country able to treat things equally? Some countries are more developed than others, and they may simply lack the infrastructure or technology or know-how to get those things treated the right way. That is an issue, and that's maybe even beyond the scope of the paper. But I think for us, some of the big flashpoints, so to speak, or flashpoint areas are when things sit. Things get, you've got your treated pallet, it gets loaded, and then sometimes it can then sit on the ground or at the port for weeks, and this is a chance for stuff to, after it's been treated and inspected, stuff can get in there. It's basically, to me, when I look at that, and there was a big diagram in that paper where we looked at all that. For me, the biggest points are when things sit somewhere, right? When they sit at the country of origin, when they sit at the new port, that gives a chance for stuff to come out. Those to me are the two biggest points, is when they're just sitting. And that's not only a point where stuff could bore into them, it's this point where stuff could get on the outside of them, right? You could have an egg mass put on there. You could have something crawl in and pupate on there. So anytime things sit in an uncontrolled environment, maybe I should put in that too. It's one thing if it sits in a controlled air, temperature or climate controlled building, pretty low risk there. But if stuff's just sitting outside on the ground, which honestly most of it is at that point, that's when you've got issues for stuff to sort of post-contaminate things, even though it's already been cleaned once, so to speak.
And is there kind of like a risk after these treatments? Things can get reinfected, or what are the main risks after the treatment?
Yeah, I mean, after the treatment, you've got, then you've got essentially this treated dry wood stuff. There's a lot of things that will bore into dry wood, the bostrichids and all that. So you've got a chance for things to bore into that wood. You've got a chance for female insects to lay eggs on it, right? Spongy moth, Lamantria species are famous for putting their eggs just kind of wherever. And then, they've had some issues with that over in Russia too, where you've got stuff just sitting there. And if it's sitting under a light at night and it happens to be mating season, where they're just going to put egg masses on all this stuff. So
Yeah.
those are issues. And just, and there was a kind of an anecdote back in the day that one of the ways they were able to reduce the chance of the Lomantria coming from Russia to the U.S. is simply to not store that stuff by the lights at night, where the moths are getting attracted to. So sometimes the fixes are fairly straightforward and simple, but until they're done, you can really have a high risk on some of this stuff.
Yeah. And one of the things that I was looking in the paper, which was super interesting for me, is everything that happens after that cargo is offloaded, right? We tend to think, okay, the pallets are like a risk. They move these boards sometimes, or egg masses or whatever. But those things are sometimes actually recycled. Or is that a possibility? Or what happens afterwards, right? Because it's not like we use the pallet and then we destroy it.
I think one of the challenges with pallets in particular, especially in the U.S., is that everything is a possibility once they get to this country. In some cases, they go from point A to point B and then they get destroyed right away. In some cases, they are used, point A to point B, and then they're sent back to point A to be used, to ship things back across the pond. In other cases, they've got this wild journey where they go from point A to point B to point C to point D to point E, and eventually end up in someone's garden or yard or something. So just the fact that there's a lot of regulations with how those wood materials are treated, right? You talked about the stamp that's supposed to be on there that shows it was treated this way at this place on this time. Once it gets to where the cargo is offloaded, there's basically no regulations on it, and it just sort of becomes free. So, if it happens to end up in the hands of someone who wants to just have a big fire, well, it probably gets burned right away. But in some cases, it's going to get reused over and over and over, and just sort of make its way across the landscape, and you have no idea where that thing is going.
Yeah, and I wanted to actually touch on that, kind of like to wrap up. One last question is, we know that these pests continue to be intercepted and they're like keep moving around, right? But I wanted to know, like, what are some of the challenges in the movement of these species, right? Like, what are we missing in terms of reducing the risk? One of the things could be, the mark, right? That mark that sometimes we have maybe like non-compliance. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's going to be a proportion of fraud that happens with literally anything in the world, right? And one of the issues is we have no idea of all the pallets that are treated, how many are fraudulently treated. We suspect it's probably a pretty low percent, but anytime money is involved, you're going to have some entity somewhere that are maybe just going to stamp it and not do anything, or maybe, like I mentioned earlier, their equipment is not quite up to snuff. You're not quite getting it hot enough. Whether that's intentional or unintentional fraud, you don't know. Again, we think it's probably not much, but it's a real challenge because you're dealing with pests that you can't see, right? And you've got to train these inspectors to look at signs. Like, you're not just going to see a butterfly flying around in there and know, oh, it's infected. You're looking for just little bits of sawdust coming out or frass tubes, and it makes it very challenging for the inspectors. And to me, the biggest challenge is just the sheer volume of stuff, right? I mean, hundreds, if not thousands, of those semi-sized containers a day on these big ports, and there's just no way that every single one of them is getting inspected. And that to me is the challenge. It's just a numbers game, right? I think the odds are fairly high, in my opinion, that something else is going to get here just based on the law of averages. So until there's a way to either reduce imports, which I do not see happening in our lifetime, or there's some sort of technology that, and I've mentioned this before, those little Tide Pods that you just like drop in the washer. If we could get one of those, something that you just chuck into every one of those containers, and it magically killed every pest in there, that would be great, right? Every time a container is shipped, you just chuck a Tide Pod in there, and it
with a lower price too, because otherwise,
I don't see
that get implemented, right?
Yeah, right. But and they've done some tests to see if you can put light traps inside these containers, right, to attract the stuff in there. Until there's some sort of technology that helps us do that, I think we're kind of stuck where we are. It's a tricky system, and I think we learned a lot in putting that paper together. I mentioned earlier it took us a 3-year project. We had to do that, but we learned a lot. Like, holy cow, this is complicated, and it will take obviously international cooperation and then piggybacking on that, we had authors on that from Canada, the U.S. and Mexico, excuse me, and every one of those countries does things a little bit different at the ports, and there's not. You'd think, oh, it's one continent, but there's not really consistency, and that makes it tricky too. And that I don't know, there's just so many moving parts. It's going to take a lot more work to really, really figure it out. But in the meantime, we try to be as observant and vigilant as we can. As an educator, I try to make sure that we work with our APHIS and CBP people to make sure they know exactly what they're looking for, and we do the best we can with what we've got.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, Dave, thanks you very much for joining. I think that was a great talk, and this is a very cool topic that, we need, of course, more information out there. And thank you very much for joining again, and yeah, great having you here.
Yeah, Damian, thanks for having me, man. Good chatting with you.